Hey everyone, welcome to Doc Walk, the show where we walk through the docs. I'm your doc walker, Daniel, and in this video we're going to be looking at the concepts of queries and mutations, which encapsulate the fundamental building blocks of what GQL is and does. So you'll want to make sure that you have a handle on the definitions of the terminology we cover here, and that'll set you up for success in the subsequent videos we look at. So this video is mostly terminology, and the next one is too. So buckle up for that. And of course, be sure to like and subscribe. And with that being said, let's just jump into the concepts. So, and there's no better way, I think, to kick off a video about GraphQL terminology than with the definitions of query and mutation. The query of graph query language means requesting data by filtering from the backend like a GET request. And then mutation, on the other hand, means to write data to the backend like a POST request, or put and patch if we're being technical. But moving on from that, it's write operations, in other words. So this section is basically going to be talking about that aspect of GQL, and we'll get some definitions going for the main terms. So we got query and mutation. The most basic term to know is fields. Fields refer to queryable attributes of your database resources. So if you were querying a database of users, a field might be name or email address. And if you were writing this as SQL, it would be analogous to saying something along the lines of select name, email from users. So that's kind of like how that shakes out. It's a column in a database table if you want to think about it in the database context. So next one is called arguments, and arguments are the filtering aspect. And this is essentially the conditions by which you identify particular resources. So going back to the SQL example from a second ago, the argument would be a part 2 of that SQL statement that says, where, select stock, select whatever from wherever, where name equals Daniel and email equals dan@daniel.com. So those are you're looking for some specific values on specific, columns to filter by. And that's not my real email address, although I wish it was. dan@daniel.com would be pretty fun. Anyways, so next is fragments. And these are essentially a query that's been saved for a particular resource, which can be reused in subsequent queries. It's like a module of code, or a module, common library that you would share. Not literally, but just, the point is in application, you would be sharing some code from one place to another. And so, for example, take the query we had a minute ago to get a name and email. And, maybe that could be applied to not just users, but also, I don't know, some other database resource that also has a name and email. So the next terminology, we're kind of just chugging through these, but the next terminology is the operation name or operation type. And there are 3 different ones that you can use. And in my experience in real life applications, you only use 2 of them. These are the ones that we were talking about earlier. The first type is queries, and then the second type is mutations. The last one is a subscription. And, I already covered what queries and mutations are. So I won't rehash that. But a subscription would be something along the lines of, what you'd use for maintaining an open connection with the server, as in the case of WebSockets, and concepts like that. Essentially, if you were doing something with WebSockets, this would be sort of an analogous. I don't know what the term is, but this would be the analogous operation you would call it. But like I said, in my several years of using GraphQL for various projects and different websites and so on, I've never heard of this operation type until today. So unless your experience is wildly different than mine, you probably don't have to worry about it. The next concept to know is related to variables, or it's called variables. Now, as you'd expect for other programming languages, you can define variables and reference them in queries to pass those values to the back end. And so typically speaking, the interface is done with the interface that GraphQL uses is via a JSON object, and variables are noted as such with a $sign in front of them. For example, $name would mean that there's a variable to be interpolated called name, and whatever you define as $name will be sent as that, like the name equals Daniel or email equals dan@daniel.com. And that's sort of like how, that's the syntax. And, a variable is what's used for codifying what you're filtering by, essentially. So we're getting close to the end here, and so hang in there with me for a little bit more. The next one is called directives, and this is another concept that I had to discover via the docs as opposed to out in the real world. But don't glaze over just yet, because they could be helpful. And there are essentially two directives which take Boolean conditions, and they are called include and skip. So to implement a condition with a directive, you'll say to include results of X condition if X condition is true, or to skip if X condition is true. And as I mentioned, I haven't encountered this in my life, but maybe you will, so it's helpful to be aware of. It is in the docs, and this is the doc walk after all. So last but not least, we have inline fragments. And this is a little tricky, but we'll power through it. At its most basic, a query has essentially a database resource that's being queried, and you're requesting specific fields of data from that table. Now, additionally, you might want to request fields of associated tables, and the way to do that would be with an inline fragment. So in the example, in the case that we've been using up to this point for querying name and email, if you wanted to also get weather, you would have to jump to another table in the database, probably the city table, and find the user's city, and the requested value is the weather of the city at that time. That might even be a further table from there. But the point is, in the same way that database tables are associated with each other, you can hook into that aspect of your backend, using this tool essentially. So to make that happen, you'd use an inline fragment and you'd request name, email, and weather, but the weather field would be nested in the query by saying on city, where city is the resource associated with a user. So, okay. We made it through a lot of terms, good job. And this is the majority of them, although there are some more in the next one. But for the most part, we are through the verbiage of GraphQL, and this is, like I said, setting us up for success in the subsequent videos. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you found it thought-provoking and helpful, and I'll see you all in the next one.